is CBS News Special Report. I'm Gail King with Anthony Mason and Tony DeCopel here in New York. We're about to hear an historic formal announcement of articles of impeachment accusing President Trump of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic chairman of 5 House committees are all set to reveal the charges on Capitol Hill. Now, this is only the 4th time in history that Congress is acting to potentially remove a president of the United States from office.
Sources tell CBS News the 2 articles focus on an effort to pressure Ukraine's government to investigate Mr. Trump's political rival, former Vice President Joe Biden, and the 2016 election. The full House could vote on these articles of impeachment as soon as next week.
Coming up fast, Nancy Cordes is on Capitol Hill for us. She's been covering the impeachment investigation from the very beginning. So, Nancy, good morning. We've got 2 articles, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. We're used to hearing obstruction of justice. This is obstruction of Congress. Can you walk us through the 2 articles and tell us what they mean?
Absolutely. Abuse of power, Democrats say, has to do with the president's attempts to use his office for personal gain contrary to the national interest. They say that when the president asked the president of Ukraine to investigate his campaign rival, Joe Biden, at the same time that Mr. Trump was withholding $400 million worth of military aid to Ukraine, that hurt U.S. national security, and it was meant to benefit Mr. Trump and his re-election effort, and solely Mr. Trump. Moving on from there, obstruction of Congress. That has to do with all the ways in which Democrats say this president tried to block the impeachment inquiry, refusing to allow top aides to testify, refusing to hand over documents despite all the subpoenas that were issued to the White House and the State Department and the Defense Department. Democrats believe these 2 articles of impeachment, which are a focus that is more narrow than some had initially wanted, makes this case easy to prove, easy to understand, easy to sell to the American people.
So does that mean now that they've decided not to include any of the evidence from the Russia investigation? We all know that was a debate within the party.
That was a fierce debate. There were some Democrats who felt that Robert Mueller in his report laid out all these instances of potential obstruction of justice when the president blocked the investigation from getting information that it wanted. Democrats felt if we've got that information, why not work it into impeachment? Wouldn't that make the case even stronger? But you had a number of other Democrats, a lot of moderates, Nancy Pelosi herself, which is a big factor, who felt that keeping impeachment more narrowly focused would give them a more airtight case, a case backed up with a great deal of evidence, a case focused solely on this Ukraine controversy and nothing else. And it appears that that's the side that won out, Gail.
All right, thanks, Nancy. Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett has covered the Trump administration since it began. He also covered the last presidential impeachment, where Bill Clinton was put on trial 20 years ago. Major, good morning.
Good morning.
Why do you think that the Democrats have backed away from a word that they used quite prominently not so long ago, bribery, and also extortion? What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, they clearly don't believe they have the evidence to make that case stick. Bribery, extortion, those were words that had great power and force just about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, absent from this docket, if you will, of impeachment articles. And there's also something else conspicuously missing, obstruction of justice. As Gail noted, that's what we're typically accustomed to hearing from when Congress decides whether or not a president has done something so bad that it must impeach the president. Obstructing justice has been part and parcel of both the Clinton and Nixon impeachment procedures. Not so this time. Why? Because House Democrats have, by any historical measure, accelerated this impeachment process. So they have not gone through what other impeachment processes have. Court challenges over disputed access to documents and or witnesses. If a White House defies a court order to comply with the congressional subpoena, then you can propound an article of obstruction of justice. But Democrats don't want to wait for those court procedures. In some cases, haven't even engaged them to test this question in court. So they're left with obstruction of Congress, which is a smaller sounding and, in the history of impeachment, less enforceable or less, let's say, strident accusation against the White House. In both cases, House Democrats are in full public view walking back away from some of the things they were alleging quite loudly just 2 weeks ago.
Major, you mentioned the timing and the pace of this. It's going quite quickly. What is the timing and the pace, and also the pattern of voting with party line votes all the way? What does that say about politics at this moment in the age of Trump and also going into 2020?
One of the most fascinating things about this procedure, Tony, is that the things that are most contested are the things that are in full public view. This is not an impeachment argument about something that happened in secret that has been unearthed. Democrats say, read the transcript. The president is quite clearly using a quid pro quo, leverage of the power of the United States over a weaker ally, Ukraine. The White House looks at it and says, we released the transcript. It's completely exonerating. Democrats say, look at the videotape of the president on the south lawn of the White House saying, China, investigate the Bidens. They look at that and say to the country, that is absolute proof the president wants another foreign nation to meddle in our upcoming 2020 election. The White House looks at that and says, that's just the president being a hardball transactional leader, forcing a way to deal with corruption. That in itself exemplifies the differences of self-same evidence. Here are the chairmen of the relevant House committees approaching the microphones.
Good morning, everyone. On this solemn day, I recall that the first order of business for members of Congress is the solemn act to take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. With great respect and gratitude that I thank the chairs of the committees, the 6 committees who have been working to help us honor our oath of office. I also want to thank the staff of those committees and the committee members for all of their work over this period of time to help us protect and defend. I want to thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler, chair of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Schiff, chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Chairman, all of these chairmen, Chairman Richie Neal of Massachusetts, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Elliot Engel of New York, the chair of the Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters of California, the chair of the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. I also want to acknowledge the important work that was done by our dear and departed, may rest in peace, Elijah Cummings as chair of the Oversight Committee. Now pleased to yield to the distinguished chair of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Over the last several months, the investigative committees of the House have been engaged in an impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump's efforts to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 elections, efforts that compromised our national security and threatened the integrity of our elections. Throughout this inquiry, he has attempted to conceal the evidence from Congress and from the American people. Our president holds the ultimate public trust. When he betrays that trust and puts himself before country, he endangers the Constitution, he endangers our democracy, and he endangers our national security. The framers of the Constitution prescribed a clear remedy for presidents who so violate their oath of office. That is the power of impeachment. Today, in service to our duty to the Constitution and to our country, the House Committee on the Judiciary is introducing 2 articles of impeachment charging the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, with committing high crimes and misdemeanors. The first article is for abuse of power. It is an impeachable offense for the President to exercise the powers of his public office to obtain an improper personal benefit while ignoring or injuring the national interest. That is exactly what President Trump did when he solicited and pressured Ukraine to interfere in our 2020 presidential election. thus damaging our national security, undermining the integrity of the next election, and violating his oath to the American people. These actions, moreover, are consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in our 2016 presidential election. And when he was caught, when the House investigated and opened an impeachment inquiry, President Trump engaged in unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of the impeachment inquiry. This gives rise to the second article of impeachment for obstruction of Congress. Here, too, we see a familiar pattern in President Trump's misconduct. A president who declares himself above accountability, above the American people, and above Congress's power of impeachment, which is meant to protect against threats to our democratic institutions, is a president who sees himself as above the law. We must be clear. No one, not even the president, is above the law. I want to recognize the great contributions of the investigative chairs, particularly Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, Foreign Affairs Chairman Eliot Engel, Committee on Oversight and Reform's former chairman, the late Elijah Cummings, and its new chairwoman, Carolyn Maloney, Financial Services Chairwoman Maxine Waters, and Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal, who helped lay the foundation for the articles we are introducing today. I also want to thank my Judiciary Committee colleagues who were critical in our work to hold the President accountable and in the drafting of these articles. Later this week, the Judiciary Committee will meet to consider these articles of impeachment and to make a recommendation to the full House of Representatives. We do not take this action lightly, but we have taken an oath to defend the Constitution. And unlike President Trump, we understand that our duty, first and foremost, is to protect the Constitution and to protect the interests of the American people. That is why we must take this solemn step today. Elections are the cornerstone of democracy and are foundational to the rule of law. But the integrity of our next election is at risk from a president who has already sought foreign interference in the 2016 and 2020 elections and who consistently puts himself above country. That is why we must act now. I want to turn now to Chairman Schiff, who will explain the evidence that supports these articles and the need for us to act with such urgency today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and to my colleagues, good morning. The framers of the Constitution recognized that someday a president might come to office who would abuse that office, betray the public trust, and undermine national security to secure foreign help in his reelection, and who would seek to abrogate the power of Congress to hold him accountable. They recognized this danger, and they prescribed a remedy, and that remedy is impeachment. It is an extraordinary remedy and one that I've been reluctant to recommend until the actions of President Trump gave Congress no alternative. We stand here today because the president's continuing abuse of his power has left us no choice. To do nothing would make ourselves complicit in the president's abuse of his high office, the public trust, and our national security. The president's misconduct is as simple and as terrible as this. President Trump solicited a foreign nation, Ukraine, to publicly announce investigations into his opponent and a baseless conspiracy theory promoted by Russia to help his reelection campaign. President Trump abused the power of his office by conditioning two official acts to get Ukraine to help his reelection: the release of hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid that nation desperately needed, and a White House meeting with an ally trying to fend off Russian aggression. In so doing, he undermined our national security and jeopardized the integrity of our next election. And he does so still. The evidence of the president's misconduct is overwhelming and uncontested. And how could it not be when the president's own words on July 25th
I would like you to do us a favor, though. Lays so bare his intentions, his willingness to sacrifice the national security for his own personal interests. And when the president got caught, he committed his second impeachable act, obstruction of Congress of the very ability to make sure that no one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. The evidence is every bit as strong that President Trump has obstructed Congress fully, without precedent, and without basis in law. If allowed to stand, it would decimate Congress's ability to conduct oversight of this president or any other in the future, leaving this president and those who follow to be free to be as corrupt, malfeasant, or incompetent as they would like, with no prospect of discovery or accountability. Now, some would argue, why don't you just wait? Why don't you just wait until you get these witnesses the White House refuses to produce? Why don't you just wait until you get the documents the White House refuses to turn over? And people should understand what that argument really means. It has taken us 8 months to get a lower court ruling that Don McGahn has no absolute right to defy Congress. 8 months for one court decision. If it takes us another 8 months to get a second court or maybe a Supreme Court decision, people need to understand that is not the end of the process. It comes back to us and we ask questions because he no longer has absolute immunity, and then he claims something else, that his answers are privileged and we have to go back to court for another 8 or 16 months. The argument, why don't you just wait, amounts to this. Why don't you just let him cheat in one more election? Why not let him cheat just one more time? Why not let him have foreign help just one more time? That is what that argument amounts to. The president's misconduct goes to the heart of whether we can conduct a free and fair election in 2020. It is bad enough for a candidate to invite foreign interference in our political process, but it is far more corrosive for a president to do so and to abuse his power to make it so. Despite everything we have uncovered, the president's misconduct continues to this day, unapologetically and right now. As we saw when he stood on the White House lawn and he was asked, what did you want in that July 25th call? And he said the answer was a simple one. And not just a simple one on July 25th, but a simple one today, and that is he still wants Ukraine to interfere in our election to help his campaign. Even this week, the president's lawyer was back in Ukraine seeking to revive the same debunked conspiracy theory promoted at the president's behest. Which gets to the final and most pernicious of the arguments that we have heard in the president's defense. That the president can do whatever he wants under Article 2, including get foreigners involved in our elections, and we should just, to quote the president's chief of staff, get over it. Ben Franklin said, we have a republic if we can keep it. The president and his men say, you can't keep it, and Americans should just get over it. Americans don't get to decide American elections anymore, not by themselves, not without foreign help. For the members of Congress, this is not a question of fact because the facts are not seriously contested. It is rather a question of duty. The president's oath of office appears to mean very little to him, but the articles put forward today will give us a chance to show that we will defend the Constitution and that our oath means something to us. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker.
Speaker.
Why not Madam Speaker.
Report, obstruction of justice. Why not do that?
Well, you've just heard from House Democratic leaders announcing 2 articles of impeachment against President Trump. The articles accuse him of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress in connection with the efforts to push Ukraine to investigate the president's political rivals. Weijia Zhang is at the White House. Weijia, President Trump has said if the Democrats are going to impeach him, do it now and do it fast so there can be a fair trial in the Senate. It appears that they are giving him exactly what he asked for. It's very sobering, I have to say, to hear Jerry Nadler say, we're accusing the president of violating his oath to the office of the American people and charging Donald J. Trump with high crimes and misdemeanors. So how is the White House preparing for all of this?
Well, Gil, they have been preparing for quite some time because they always anticipated that this day would come. And so there are two parts to their defense strategy. The first is engulfing the existing record, making sure that they're going through all the evidence that's already out here. So they're pouring through transcripts, witness testimony, other documents, so they know that. The other part is preparing witnesses. And senior administration officials told us they couldn't really hone in on that part until this very moment, when they knew the exact articles of impeachment, because that will drive who they hope to call. Of course, President Trump himself has said that he wants to see live witnesses on the stand instead of tape depositions like we saw during the Clinton impeachment. And he even has a wish list that includes the Bidens, Adam Schiff, House Speaker Pelosi, the whistleblower. And that really just goes back to what the president continues to argue. That goes to his attempt to show that this entire process has been illegitimate. And so he continues to attack it. And all of those witnesses, he believes, would help him make that case. So now is the time for White House counsel and the president to convey what they want to Speaker Mitch McConnell, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who will ultimately decide the parameters of that Senate trial. Gail.
All right. Thank you very much, Weija.
Nancy Cordes was in the room when Democrats announced their articles of impeachment, and she's been covering this for us from the start. Nancy, I was struck with one thing. There were 7 House members up there led by Nancy Pelosi, of course, all Democrats from just 3 states, New York, California, Massachusetts, which just continually emphasizes the divide here. We know which way Republicans are going to go. Does Nancy Pelosi have all the Democrats on board?
If she doesn't, she's pretty close, Anthony. She only lost a couple of Democrats in the last vote, and part of the reason that they decided to stick with this more narrowly constructed set of articles of impeachment, only 2, no bribery, no obstruction of justice, is because some of her more moderate members were uncomfortable with the idea of dipping back into the Russia investigation when crafting these articles of impeachment. So the fact that they have decided to construct this so narrowly, to rely on 2 articles of impeachment that Democrats across the board feel that they can clearly and concisely defend, that is going to help her keep her party together. Now, will she be able to win over any Republicans? Probably not. But Democrats say they believe that ship has probably sailed at this point. They're comfortable with going it alone.
All right, Nancy, thank you very much. Our coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com or on our CBS News app.
And there will be more to come on your local news on this CBS station and, of course, tonight on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell. At this point, many of you return now to CBS This Morning.
This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Gail King with Tony DeCopel and Anthony Mason, CBS News, New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.